Hello, my name is Julian Frattini from the Blekinge Institute of Technology, and I will present our work on automatic extraction of cause-effect relations from requirements artifacts. The problem is set within the requirements engineering domain, where requirements are manifested within artifacts. These artifacts are predominantly written in natural language, even though a plethora of formal and controlled languages have been constructed to deal with the ambiguity of natural language. This ambiguity introduces error-prone interpretations of the requirements and can be counteracted by formalizing sentences. Sentences conveying causal relations, further called causal sentences, contain valuable information for the software development process if they can be identified and formalized, for example into cause-effect graphs. These graphs mitigate ambiguity and are also highly reusable for other artifacts, for example in a model-based test generation approach. The transformation of a cause-effect graph into a test case has already been showcased. So in this paper, we explore an automatization approach for the extraction of cause-effect graphs from natural language requirements. There are existing approaches for automatic causality extraction, which I only want to hint at here. These approaches are mostly based on large natural language corpora, which are then scanned for recurring relations between word-wise events. These recurring events are then identified as causally related. However, two major shortcomings make these approaches unusable for the requirements engineering context. First, a large natural language corpus might not be at hand at an early requirements engineering stage or ever. Recurring patterns are therefore hard to identify. Second, the most common approaches extract only events represented by single words, mostly noun phrases. This process omits vital information, which would be important in the extracted relation for a proper reuse. Our approach attempts to cope with these shortcomings. The procedure of the cause-effect recognition system, short CREC, is divided into two tasks. Given a list of natural language sentences, the first task is a classification into causal and non-causal sentences. Second, the cause-effect relationship from each causal sentence shall be extracted into a cause-effect graph. This is realized with a pattern-based machine learning approach. Each pattern consists of mainly two components, a signature and a phrase extraction method. The signature identifies the grammatical equivalence class of the pattern. A sentence must be syntactically equivalent to a pattern signature in order to be compliant to the pattern. The phrase extraction method is an algorithm which, when applied to a compliant sentence, extracts the cause-effect graph from the sentence. How the patterns are used to achieve the aforementioned tasks will be outlined in this slide and further explained in the following. In the first step, the natural language sentences are formalized via natural language processing techniques. The result is a graph-like representation of the sentence based on constituency parsing, which will be also showcased in the next slide. Then the formalized sentence is compared to the signature of each pattern in the list of already existing patterns. If the sentence is compliant to one pattern, the phrase extraction method associated with that pattern will be applied to the sentence and the cause-effect graph is extracted. If a causal sentence is not compliant to any pattern, then the system requires an active training from the user. All of these steps will now be shown in detail in the following slides. The first step in the pipeline is the formalization of the natural language sentence. Natural language processing techniques, more specifically constituency and dependency parsing, as well as part-of-speech tagging, construct a graph-like structure from the sentence. The leaf nodes of the resulting graph represent the words of the sentence, each annotated with its part-of-speech tag. These leaves are recursively grouped into chunks represented by the gray nodes. The root node with the label S represents the whole sentence. Prominent chunks are noun phrases labeled as NP and verb phrases labeled as VP. The result of the dependency parser is represented by the interconnections between leaf nodes below the graph and are only used as secondary identification of the syntax. Once a sentence has been formalized, its compliance to a pattern can be determined. Each pattern is identified by a signature, which has to be a subset of the sentence's constituency parsers in order for the sentence to be compliant. In this example, you can see that the sentence is compliant to pattern 1, since its syntactic structure contains the signature of pattern 1. The sentence is not compliant to pattern 2 because its syntactic structure does not contain the signature of pattern 2. You can also see an additional constraint to the signature. One of the nodes requires not only a specific constituency tag, but also a specific word. These lexical constraints utilize causal cue phrases to identify causality. A sentence that is compliant to pattern 2 also requires the keyword if contained as a child of the VP node. In summary, the signature of patterns creates a syntactical equivalence class to which causal sentences can be compliant. Once the syntactical equivalence class of the sentence has been identified in form of the compliant pattern, the phrase extraction method associated with the pattern is applied to the sentence. The phrase extraction method is a dynamic algorithm which selects certain nodes from the syntactic structure of the sentence and constructs the cause-effect graph of the sentence accordingly. Since the sentence was found to be grammatically equivalent to other sentences compliant to the pattern, it is feasible to assume that the same phrase extraction method is applicable to the sentence to extract the cause-effect graph. In this simple case of a cause-effect graph consisting only of one cause and one effect node, the phrase extraction method also consists only of two nodes. The instructions of each node are then resolved. For the cause node, the method traverses the syntactic tree to the node labeled S bar, which represents a subordinate clause. From this node, the parented S node is selected. Similarly, the effect phrase is extracted by selecting the NP and the VP phrase. Once the nodes containing the causal phrases are identified, all parented children nodes are selected and the cause-effect graph is constructed. You can see that the introduction of a dedicated phrase extraction method mitigates the shortcomings of other causality extraction approaches, where the causality is only identified between two words. The phrase extraction method can be tailored to an arbitrary portion of the sentence and does therefore not omit any information important for the resulting cause-effect graph. This concludes the example for successful sentence recognition and extraction. I want to conclude the technical explanation with a step back and display the case that a causal sentence is not compliant to any pattern. As stated in the initial diagram, a sentence that is not compliant to any pattern, though it being causal, has to be actively trained. This requires a user to manually construct the cause-effect graph which conveys the sentence's causality and which is expected to be extracted from the system. Since the sentence was not compliant to any pattern, a new pattern has to be created. First to create is the signature of the pattern. The shape of the signature depends on the current status of known sentences. For this showcase, I will use a strongly simplified sentence, whose syntactic structure only consists of 3 nodes. I will now explain how different shapes the signature of the newly created pattern would take, depending on the existing patterns. If there exists no pattern yet, then the signature will only consist of the minimal subtree of the sentence's syntactic structure, the root node labeled S. Since there is no other sentence from which this equivalence class has to be differentiated, the S node suffices to identify the class. However, if the system has already discovered a non-causal sentence of the following structure, the signature has to be more specific in order to prevent that similar non-causal sentences, like the one already known, will be compliant to the causality pattern. You can see that the node labeled IN, which represents a conjunction, sufficiently differentiates the two sentences structures from each other, such that the causal sentence would be compliant to the pattern and the non-causal sentence not. There is a more complex case of a causality pattern already existing to which the sentence might be compliant, but the phrase extraction method does not yield the correct cause-effect graph. This may be the case when the pattern is not specific enough, which is common in early stages of training. In this case, the two causal sentences have to be differentiated from each other and made compliant to different patterns. While the pattern for the new sentence gets a signature as in the case with the non-causal sentence, The old pattern also has to be made more specific. The compliance of the new sentence to the existing pattern, which was apparently wrong, has to be prevented in the future. Therefore, nodes are added to the signature of the old pattern, such that sentences that are syntactically similar to the new sentence will not be compliant to that pattern. This process is referred to as specification of a pattern signature. This way, the patterns are maintained while also keeping only a minimal number of nodes for the identification. Once a signature is created for a new pattern, the phrase extraction method has to be constructed. Since the desired cause-effect graph has been given manually for training, the C-REC system can reverse engineer the instructions necessary to select the phrase. The minimal set of encompassing nodes is selected for each node of a cause-effect graph, and a selection algorithm for these nodes is generated. With this method, an arbitrary substring of a sentence can be selected for every causal node. The previously created minimal signature together with the generated phrase extraction method forms the new pattern. All sentences of similar syntactic structure will be compliant to the pattern, and due to their grammatical equivalence, it is feasible to assume that the phrase extraction method will be reusable on those compliant sentences. The following diagram summarizes the training process of a natural language sentence. The formal notation is fully explained in the proceedings paper, but to give a quick rundown of the possible cases for each path. The left half of the chart shows the handling of a causal sentence. The previously unknown causal sentence requires the creation of a new pattern. Any other syntactically similar sentence is then recognized successfully, which is the desired outcome of the process. Wrong compliance has to be resolved via the aforementioned specification. The handling of non-causal sentences is described in the right half. Typically, non-causal sentences are not compliant to any patterns and therefore correctly discarded. If they are wrongfully compliant, the pattern signature has to be specified again in order to prevent this compliance. This approach has been preliminarily evaluated on a set of publicly available requirements artifacts, which were annotated manually and then processed with a cross-validation method. Two research questions were explored. 1. Where an artifact was analyzed on an empty database of patterns, and 2. Where an artifact was only analyzed after the C-REC system has been trained with all other artifacts before. This way, the database already contained pre-trained patterns. The results clearly point out the lack of maturity of the approach. Though some artifacts show promising results of almost 50% automatic extraction, other artifacts do not convince at performing their tasks. A few key insights can be taken from this. First, the rate of recognition is dependent on the number of causal sentences within an artifact. As with any learning algorithm, the training data is the most influential contribution to the success of an algorithm. Second, the lack of maturity of the approach manifests in a lack of improvement with previous training, as the results of research question 2 show. This can be attributed to an overspecification of the patterns, as a high precision rate shows a strong bias against recall. It is also worth noting that the second research question was performed under the worst conditions possible, as the different artifacts did not share any common guidelines for writing the requirements. However, the preliminary evaluation strengthens our confidence that this approach is actually viable and applicable, given some improvements and a proper dataset to train. The following limitations are in this regard the challenges to overcome. For one, the annotated cause-effect graphs of the test set have been simplified to graphs containing only one cause and one effect node. Causal sentences and requirements artifacts can be far more complex, and in order to properly utilize the approach, this has to be embraced. Secondly, the application of the automatic extraction approach has to be proven. We are confident that the extracted causal relations will be highly valuable in practice, but an application of the automatic extraction approach has to be evaluated in an actual practical context. The third limitation, however, is something we cannot influence but only explore: the bond between syntax and semantics. How eligible lexicosyntactic patterns are for the identification of semantic relations is yet unexplored. Whether our approach can be used to avoid semantic detection algorithms and focus on syntax remains to be seen. This brings me to the conclusion, including the future work. Ongoing studies prepare an evaluation of the usability of causal relations and their extraction in practice. Furthermore, the insights from practitioners, as well as a tailored dataset for training, will be used to improve the robustness of the extraction algorithm and to increase its maturity. Finally, on a more experimental note, the lexicosyntactic pattern-based approach might be also reused for other semantic relations, which could result in research towards the bond between syntax and semantics in natural language, further intensifying our understanding of natural language processing. With this, I want to end this talk. I want to thank you for your attention.